In the previous topic, we had used Azure RBAC to provide access or provide Azure resource access to the user 3IAM-user. Now that is a very general use case because of course there would be a lot of users in your organization. Typically the Azure security admins use group to assign access using Azure RBAC. As we'll be doing a lot of hands-on ourselves for the training, for Fabric, for Azure AI, etc., we need to know how to provide other levels of access also. What I mean by that is, what if you have applications or workloads which want to authenticate and get access to Azure resources? For example, let's say you have Azure Fabric and you want to read data from Azure Blob Storage or ADLS. How do you do that? Or let's say you have a virtual machine and there's an application inside of the virtual machine and you have Azure Blob Storage and this application wants to access data which is stored in Azure Blob Storage. You see, this is a non-human security principle. This is not neither a user nor a group because it is an application which is running inside of a virtual machine. You can think of it as Azure Synapse. You can think of it as Azure Fabric, any resource for that matter. Let's say there's some application running inside of the resource and that application wants to access some other Azure resource. So that's where the Azure managed identities are used. Now, when you use managed identity, we assign it to the Azure resource, and then the resource can access the other Azure resource. And using managed identity, one resource can access other Azure resource. In this case, the first resource is the virtual machine, and the second resource is the Azure Blob Storage. There can be other resources also like Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB, etc. And there can be other source resources also like Microsoft Fabric, Azure Kubernetes Cluster, etc. So managed identities are mostly used for service-to-service authentication and authorization. So when one service needs to access another service or another resource, then we use Azure managed identity to provide access. Now in this case, this is a service which is a virtual machine or one resource, and this virtual machine wants to access another resource which is Azure Blob Storage. So that's how you can use managed identity. Similar would be the case for Microsoft Fabric or AKS cluster also. And there are two types of managed identities that are provided. One is the system assigned managed identity and the other one is the user assigned managed identity. Using system assigned managed identity, what we do is that we assign the access to the resource itself. So that is system assigned managed identity. If you do not want to do that, you can use user assigned managed identity also, in which case we'll have to create a separate resource and the name of the resource would be managed identity. And we'll be using RBAC and we'll be using role assignment to provide access to the managed identity, and then service to service or resource to resource access would be possible. Similarly, we have service principal. Service principal is similar to managed identity, or actually it is the other way around. Managed identity is a special type of service principal which is used to access resource within the Azure ecosystem. Now let's say there are resources which are outside of Azure, then you'll be using service principal. And to do that, you'll have to register the resource or application which is outside of Azure in the Azure Entra ID. I'll show you how to register, but I'll not be doing any hands-on as such because I do not have a separate third-party application in this case. So first, let us go ahead and create a managed identity, both system generated and user generated. And then I'll show you how we can use service principal, how we can register an external resource or application in Azure Entra ID for service principal.